First tonight, an investigation by leading international news organizations has accused the European Union of knowing involvement in human rights violations against migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. A year-long investigation by international media, including the Washington Post, Le Monde and El País, alleges that EU money is behind the appalling mistreatment of sub-Saharan African migrants. The EU has paid hundreds of millions of dollars to North African countries to help them stem migration. The journalists interviewed 50 migrants who said they'd been dumped in the most inhospitable parts of North Africa, left without food or water, and exposed to kidnapping, torture, sexual violence, and in some cases death. Under the European Union's laws, it's obliged to respect fundamental human rights, but it's conceded that rights assessments are not conducted when funding migrant projects. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by Arise International correspondent Faith Orr. Good to see you, Faith. Tell us more about the allegations. I understand these international news organizations have recorded harrowing testimony from migrants.
There are so many stories involved in this report from people who have actually been dumped in remote areas. Lots and lots of them. We know that there's been at least 11 dumps verified in Tunisia involving around 90 migrants each time. Some of these people have been dumped in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert, no food, no water. They've been walking to villages, begging for food and water, in some occasions badly beaten by those villagers. One man told a story of the people he was with. They had to walk 9 days, 345 miles until they reached an area of safety and people who were willing to help them. Other stories involve people being dropped in areas where armed groups operate. Tunisian officials dropping people near the Algerian border and pushing them towards that border. They said that Algerian forces were firing at them and pushing them back into Tunisia. Now, most of these people have been intercepted at sea. I mean, we're looking at pictures there of migrants on boats in the Mediterranean. Now, that is a problem. That is what this is all designed to stop. It's designed to stop people attempting to make these journeys. Now, these stories have been verified because some of the migrants managed to keep their phones on them, so they've managed to take photos and videos during their journeys. The GPS has also been tracked and verified by these researchers. We know that dozens of people have died in these dumps, many, many more missing, and they're being dropped in the desert as a punishment. I think there is just one story that's slightly different to the general ones that I want to share with you. And one man described how he was picked up on the street and he was sold to Libyan guards for about $6, and then he was held for ransom. He was held in a confined area with about 500 others for 2 months until his mother could fetch $1,000 to release him. He said during that time he wasn't allowed to wash, he was fed very little, and he was beaten badly. He showed these researchers marks on his feet, which he said was made by machete hacks by the guards. I mean, it's just horrendous stories coming out of here. People particularly being picked off the streets in Morocco. We heard the story of one American man, because it's all racial profiling. It's only black migrants that they're picking. And the American man, I mean, he wasn't there illegally. He was living there. He showed them his US ID. It made absolutely no difference. They still picked him up and dropped him in the middle of the desert. Other people collected despite having refugee papers from UNHCR. So yeah, a lot of racial profiling involved in these horrendous stories.
Absolutely horrendous is the word, and the EU has been sending millions of dollars to these North African countries to help stem migration. I mean, that's the big picture, but we understand that these projects are difficult to track and there is a lack of transparency.
Exactly. So it's Tunisia, Morocco and Mauritania that have been getting most of this money. 400 million euros to be precise between 2015 and 2021. Now, this is part of the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, and as you say, that is designed almost solely to stem migration. There are dozens of other projects that have been funded separate to that, and this is where it really gets tricky because they don't know how to keep track of that. There's a complete lack of transparency in the EU funding system. Last year we know an extra 105 million euros was also sent to Tunisia. In February this year an extra 210 million euros went to Mauritania. There's also been vehicles sent to these countries which have been used to collect these migrants and drive them out to these remote areas. These vehicles provided by the EU to local security forces. The Tunisian National Guard is at the heart of this story and some of the worst ones involved in it. Germany spent 1 million euros training about 4,000 members of that National Guard. So EU countries are really involved in this, but as you say, trying to keep their hands clean. As these dumps were ongoing, we know that a €9 million training centre opened in Tunisia. That was funded by Austria, Denmark and the Netherlands. So a lot of EU countries very involved in this.
So basically the Europeans are aware of this, but they don't want to be the ones with dirty hands or the ones responsible for the violation of human rights. So they're subcontracting these violations to third parties. But in fact, the EU Commission is now being held responsible.
Well, yes, exactly, and that's because there's a lot of evidence provided in this report that EU officials knew exactly what was happening. We did hear from one official that they had been holding internal discussions since about 2019. So certainly for years and years the EU has been aware of this. Allegations also flagged in reports from the UNHCR, of course the UN Agency for Refugees, and in Frontex reports, which is the EU's border agency. The European Commission also conceded that human rights assessments hadn't been carried out on the projects that all of this money was going to fund. They say that agencies who receive the funds are meant to carry out monitoring processes, but EU officials privately admit that this is almost impossible to regulate. They simply cannot keep on top of it. We have, the report did see this internal report from Frontex regarding Morocco, which noted allegations of racial profiling, and this is a quote from the report, so let me not get it wrong, allegations of racial profiling, excessive use of force by the police and other law enforcement officials against migrants, asylum seekers and refugees, as well as arbitrary arrests, detentions and forced relocation from the north to the south, which disproportionately affected migrants from sub-Saharan countries. So that is in a report written by, about Morocco by Frontex, EU's border agency. So the EU knew exactly what was happening.
I think what also indicts the EU most is the fact that the people who carried out this investigation, it was a year-long investigation. Several months ago, they tried to reach the EU, tried to interview them, tried to get there, and the EU simply wouldn't respond. So it's not as if they were not aware of it. But what about the North African countries? Has there been any response to this from them?
We've actually had some response from the EU as well. They did previously, one official previously acknowledged knowledge of these dumps, but said the bloc was in no way sponsoring it. So they are still denying part of that. The European Commission as well said that the migrant management aid is meant to defend the rights of migrants and that it's being misused. And yes, we have had responses from these North African countries, officials in Tunisia, Morocco and Mauritania. They are denying racial profiling is taking place. They say the only time that anyone is sent to remote areas is when they're being sent over borders. Morocco says that these claims are simply baseless, that they only relocate people for their protection from traffickers. Tunisia says it upholds migrants' rights and only expels anyone voluntarily, and even then only to their home countries. Now, Spain has been accused of being involved in this as well. It has not denied or confirmed knowledge that these dumps are taking place, but it has confirmed that it does have officers in Mauritania, which is where one of these migrants said she was taken from. There were Spanish officers there when she was loaded into the car and sent away. So they have acknowledged that they have officers there, but they say they're only operating with full respect to the rights of migrants, so certainly no admission from European countries.
And very briefly, of course, every year thousands of migrants make that perilous trip from Africa across the Mediterranean Sea aiming for Europe, but many don't make it, do they?
No, and the situation seems to be getting worse and worse. I mean, last year the EU recorded about 380,000 what they describe as irregular border arrivals, but that doesn't take into account the people that are turned back, the boats that sink. I mean, we see these desperate boats packed full of desperate people trying to cross the Mediterranean. Some make it, some get turned back, some get taken by the coast guards. I mean, it really is a desperate situation for them, and EU countries becoming increasingly aggressive in their approach to this, because they say they're trying to end these boat arrivals, they're trying to end the operations of traffickers, taking more of an Australian approach where you say if you're going to do this, you're simply not going to make it. It actually did work in Australia. The boat arrivals have stopped. So it's certainly not the most human approach, but it might be effective.
Faith, thanks very much indeed, and thank you for bringing that to our attention. Faith Orr is Arise International correspondent.